evening on this Vaishak Purnima, otherwise known as Buddha Purnima or Buddha Jayanti, celebrating the life of the life and birth and rebirth, as it were, of Gautama Siddhartha, the Shakyamuni, silent one of the Shakya clan. The story of Buddha's life, as he's known in short, the enlightened one, is generally widely known. But nevertheless, to ruminate over the events of his birth and life, and also of his departure from this world some 2,500 years ago, is worth contemplating. First of all, we know that he was a noble prince, that he was born there in what is now called Nepal, and that his mother received a dream of a six-tusked elephant that entered her right side, and all the wise men in the royal court agreed this was a very auspicious sign indicating the birth of a remarkable person. Just as in the life of Jesus, we find a very wise man coming to say, as soon as he saw the child, that this was some special child. He'd been doing his various austerities and leading a holy life for many years. But when he saw the child, he saw the marks of that one that would teach him, and his regret was that he wouldn't survive for such a long time, and so he wouldn't get the benefit of this world teacher. He would either be a very great king, a masterly king, or he would be the master of the senses. That is, he would be a renunciant, a spiritual leader. Knowing this, of course, he was kept away from all of the various temptations. Not only temptations, that means temptations in the sense of temptations toward doubts, but temptations were there of a different kind because he was pampered. He was pampered, he was kept away from all the sorrows and ills of the world, kept in a garden area, something like we find in later times with the Chinese emperors, kept away from all the difficulties of the world, the sufferings, the disease, the poverty, etc. And so he was quite happy to think that life was a joyful scene, a joyful scenario. And we look on our own lives and how far we departed from that same frame of mind, that same way of looking. We also see the world in a short-sighted way. There's a very famous tale that the Buddha tells. He says that there was a tiger coming to attack a man. And so he caught him and cornered him right on the edge of a precipice. And when he looked down, what did he see? He saw another tiger threatening him. One tiger lapping his lips, looking at him, seeing him as nothing more than food. And the other tiger below, looking up and salivating, seeing a nice meal there also. Caught between what we call now the devil and the deep blue sea. What to do? He had no choice. He started climbing down the precipice. And the tigers looked hungrily at their proposed victim. And he managed to catch hold of a root. But unfortunately, a rat came along and was chewing at the root. In this precarious position, he notices to the side what a beautiful colored strawberry, and says in what we might call a Homer Simpson moment, oh, look, there's a strawberry, and his attention gets diverted. And so by using simple stories like this, the Gautama Siddhartha, the great one of the Muni, one of the Shakya clan, silent one of the Shakya clan, taught simple lessons to simple people. What was the environment in which we find Buddha? It is the same environment we find all reformers that make a spiritual revolution that lasts for several thousands of years and makes a high impact on society, turns people around. Several factors were there. Firstly, we find that religion had become degraded. It had become in the hands of powerful priests. Swami Vivekananda tells us that the history of spirituality in India and all over the world for that matter is a history of the priests and prophets fighting with each other. Same thing was true in Jesus' time. So that we find the letter of the law being implemented, a kind of legalism being there, but behind it is a will to exert power, in this case in the hands of the Brahmins. And there was this great Shakyamuni who came along, born in this environment that we would mostly be happy to stay in. It reminds us of the Kathopanishad. There we find a Nachiketa, only 12 years old, but even at that young age, being tempted with all these things that the Buddha had been offered or was accustomed to having in his normal lifestyle. There we find a beautiful garden, flowers. Whenever a flower faded, it was hidden from him, taken and replaced with a flowering one which is more beautiful. He never saw decay anywhere. Nachiketa was offered, he didn't have all these things, but he was offered all these great pleasures by the Lord of Death, Yama. Who else could offer us these treasures? Who else holds the key to death and change? And yet at this tender age of 12, he rejects them all in a heroic move, a move of profound faith. Now, the beauty about Siddhartha was he was just like any of us. He didn't occur to him that the world was any different from what the senses could drink in. He was quite happy and content in his life. And then, of course, he got married, as was the custom. He exerted his strength and manliness and won over a bride. And so the two lived happily and had one son. We can confuse the story by giving the names, but you'll know all these names are there. It's commonplace to know the story of this great Gautama Siddhartha. And I want to focus, though, on the events. So, of course, he's now has an heir to the throne. He himself is the heir to the throne. The line is secured. And he's been protected from the outside world. And so you can't avoid it. You have to go and see, what is the kingdom like that I have to rule over? And so the chariot was arranged, and the charioteer came and took him out. On several excursions he went, and each time he saw something that could not be hidden. And it is well known, he saw these 4 revolutionary things. Revolutionary because it changed his mind completely. What was the first thing? He saw this peculiar man who was obviously not regular in his health. He was suffering. And he noticed all these symptoms. He'd never seen them before. We have to go along with the related story. But you see, the remarkable circumstances in which he was born showed that he was ready for a change of mind just by seeing these dramatic events, dramatic for him, commonplace to us. Commonplace to us, and we don't even think about anything more profound than we just saw it, particularly in third world countries, where we see difficult circumstances on a daily basis. Our compassion gets less. What we find throughout Buddha's life is we find feeling from top to bottom. First, we find a feeling of joy where he is in his guarded palace place. 3 palaces he was given for every season, summer, winter, autumn. He was given all these different palaces to suit the different seasons. So we can say he was thoroughly, not just well off, but actually thoroughly pampered, thinking that this was the life of everybody. Then he asks, who is this person? Oh, this person is subject to change and disease. As long as we have a body, in Ramakrishna's language, the rent for the body is disease. Ill health will prevail. This was a profound shock to him. But the second experience, of course, was that of old age. Yes, everybody's on a journey, and the rust will set in the human body. You'll become old and bent. You'll get wrinkles on your face. All of these things we know of, but don't pay much attention to. And since this was a contrast for him, he saw the impact of it. The impact of it was to make him brood. He wanted to know what was the cause of the suffering. And the third excursion, he saw a corpse being taken to the cremation ground. What is wrong with this person? You see, after the old age, death will occur. Death can occur at any time, actually. No one can escape it. Then this was a profound shock to him. What is the meaning of life? For the first time, he started asking. And then when he got back to the palace, all the dancing girls that were there, all the pleasures that were there, all the gardens that were there seemed to be hollow, and he was in a distracted mood. And in that distracted mood, he resolved. And his resolution came from the fourth sight that he saw, and that was somebody who had adopted the clothing of an ascetic, the clothing of an ascetic, taking a simple staff, simple begging bowl, and the question, who is this person and what is he bound for? Oh, this is a person who wants to discover once and for all the meaning of all this change and suffering, of all this birth, life, death syndrome. He's going on a journey of discovery. This gave a profound impact to him, and he resolved, life has no meaning unless I solve these fundamental problems. And so we find this joy, this emotion of joy, shifting to compassion, a concern for human suffering that so impresses us. Swami Vivekananda in particular was extremely possessed by the qualities of this great Buddha. In The Master as I Saw Him by Sister Nivedita, she states this, chief of intellectual passions with the Swami, meaning Swami Vivekananda, was his reverence for Buddha. It was perhaps the historical authenticity of the Indian life that was the basis of the delight it roused in him. We are sure of Buddha, he said. We are sure of Muhammad, alone among all the religious teachings. And then he claimed he had been so untouched by the vulgar craving for wonders that he coldly excommunicated the lad who had, by a word, brought down a jeweled cup from the top of a pole in the presence of the crowd. Religion, he said, had nothing to do with jugglery. That was the removal of all this superstition. It relates to a story in Buddha's life. Can you do some miracles? We know of some people who can make transformations. There's a jeweled cup on the top of a pole. Can you do something like that, some magic show? And with great disgust, the Buddha eschewed this completely. And so we find here not only feeling, emotion, compassion, which was there for all of humanity that was suffering and laboring under pains. He came to that conclusion. Life is suffering. Life is painful. This was not a novel conclusion. There were philosophers who had this understanding previously. But Buddha was not interested in metaphysics or philosophy. When somebody asked him and declared, I will leave your Sangha, leave your order, if you do not answer satisfactorily these questions, what becomes of us after death? And such profound metaphysical questions. What is our origin and beginning? Where do we all come from? Other questions would have been asked. Is there a God? Is there a soul? And we find in the story that Buddha tells of an archer who shoots somebody. And the victim is not just shot with an arrow, he's shot with a poison arrow, and his life is in great danger. He's giving this as an example. And a doctor comes along. Instead of the doctor immediately removing the poison and removing the suffering and saving a life, the victim stops him and says, before you administer this medicine to me, please tell me the caste of the archer. Please tell me what his family name is. Please tell me what region he belongs to. Please ask him, why did he shoot me? And all these questions while he's suffering. And that was his reply. We leave these questions alone because let us cure the suffering. So Buddha discovered that the way out of the suffering was to treat the symptoms that we find in this world for all of us then and today by using a kind of medical approach. Medical approach means lay out the facts. Here is your suffering. Why is the suffering there? What is the cause of it? And then here is the medicine. Here is the remedy. His simplicity came out after his enlightenment. And even after his enlightenment, and we have some gaps to fill in the story, obviously, known to everybody, he was tempted to think, well, now I have this answer for myself. That's it. I can draw the line. I can be silent. I am, after all, a Muni, a silent one, having experienced this parinirvana, equivalent to this Nirvikalpa Samadhi, having understood this unity of existence, this enlightened condition. What more is there? I have discovered the answer. But then his urge was, no, I have to turn the wheel of Dharma. That is, I have to teach this to the whole of humanity. I have to give this medicine to everybody who's suffering. This is now the generosity of spirit that makes Swami Vivekananda say, no one in the history of mankind can compare to the compassion of the Buddha. The compassionate quality of the Buddha is beyond compare, all the time thinking of humanity. Stories from his childhood also attest to this. But how did he get to this state of enlightenment? Again, using the capacity that he has for feeling. He now goes to teachers who teach him meditation. He doesn't find that this is a satisfactory route to this. He tries it. It doesn't remove the pain and suffering. That's his goal. Remove the pain and the suffering. And then he comes now and finds 5 ascetics doing penance in the forest. This kind of penance is mentioned in the Bhagavad Gita as a tamasic kind of tapasya. Punishing the body, thinking I can control the senses. If I can control the senses and strengthen my will, then this will yield the secrets of this suffering. By making me suffer more, somehow I'll find the secret of suffering. Even logically, it doesn't make any sense. Instead of honoring the vehicle for it, the human body itself. And so the Gautama Siddhartha adopted the style of the ascetics, fasting to death, fasting almost to death so that all his ribs went and you couldn't find any difference between the ribs and the backbone, the spine. And just at that moment, he managed to eat something. He was given something to eat because he felt this is not giving me what I require. It is not making any inroads into this enlightened state. I'm still full of ignorance. And so he was severely criticized by the other 5 ascetics, his companions. He has now gone into a life of luxury by simply taking some small food that sustained him, where he got his strength back. And then finding himself in the place that would normally be called now the Bo tree, the tree of enlightenment, the tree that he sat under and resolved, I will not move from this spot. Bearing in mind, he had no scripture, no teacher, none of these things, no compass, no map. This was the strength and glory of the Buddha. And sitting under this Bo tree, resolved, I will not move from this place until I get this enlightenment. And so he embarked on this introspective meditation that produced a certain element of calmness only after he got all this trammels and disturbances in the human mind that we all find. This brought up doubts, temptations, fears, embodied as Mara, the evil one, whose job really is to disturb this, because if this person gets peace, then my job as a disturbing element will be gone. So the story goes. And the meaning of it is battling all these disturbances, all these temptations and fears and doubts that beset the human mind as such. There was a man called Paul Carus. He was a Christian Methodist minister. He writes a beautiful book. He writes the Gospel of Buddha, and it's a small book, only containing some 128 pages and odd. But he there sees a remarkable similarity between the life and parables of Jesus and that of Buddha. And so we find also in Jesus' life going into the desert, 40 days, 40 nights, the mystical number is there, and also being tempted by the Judeo-Christian version of this Mara. And so we find, going through all these trials and tribulations that we all have to go, going through his own painful experience, not only physically, but now also psychologically and emotionally. He arrives at this point of nirvana, this extinction of the cause of the difficulties. What is the cause of the difficulties? Our desires, our thirst for things in the outside world, our thirst for the things that he already had and rejected in the palace. Having said goodbye to his wife, having said goodbye to his child, silently creeping out, calling his charioteer, going off, after taking off all the silken clothing, after putting on the simple garb of ascetic, a yellow robe, and then cutting all his hair off. Hair, long hairs being a sign of royalty and status. Taking all that away, he now had the formula for a sangha, an assembly of monks, an order of monks. So his enlightenment and anybody's enlightenment will show through your face, your limbs, your body. His first converts, we are told, were some people he met after this, and immediately they saw from his shining face that they were willing to join him and follow the Sangha. He met his 5 fellow ascetics who initially rejected him. They will have nothing to do with you because you have now turned to luxury, they said. And in fact, he had to tell them, no, I tried this asceticism and you yourselves haven't found any benefit in it. Paul Carus puts it like this. These several events, Blessed One tarried in solitude 7 times, 7 days, enjoying the bliss of emancipation after his enlightenment. At that time, he found 2 merchants, and they came traveling on the road nearby. And when they saw the great enlightened one, majestic and full of peace, the peaceful one, the one of equanimity of mind, approached him respectfully and offered him rice cakes and honey. This was the first food, actually, that the enlightened one ate after he attained the Buddhahood. And it is this that is given to Buddhists today to celebrate this particular Purnima. A kind of rice pudding is given. The Buddha addressed them and pointed out to them the way of salvation. Salvation from what? Not salvation from sin, salvation from pain. The possibility of that. The 2 merchants, seeing the holiness of the conqueror of Mara, bowed down in reverence and said, we take our refuge, Lord, in the Blessed One and in the Dharma. And they were the first that became the followers of the Buddha. They were his first disciples, who were lay disciples, not monastics. But he then goes and to, as I say, to his former colleagues and persuades them that the middle way is best. Neither asceticism extreme on the one side, nor abundant luxury on the other, but there's a middle way. Sustain the body, but go deep inside. And then he taught the simplicity of his message. That is, the medicine that he was prescribing had these 4 components. 4 components because you can now teach this to everyone. And the equality that he had was really found in a revolutionary way. No caste, no distinction in social status, even no distinction in gender. And so, to the simple people, not interested in highfalutin metaphysics, not interested in intricate philosophy and argument and dialectics. Swami Vivekananda said, if you have the compassion of Buddha and the intellect of Shankaracharya, this would be useful, you see. This is useful in this current age. Now what happened was, on one hand, he's able to say, these are the 4 noble truths. You are suffering because suffering exists and the world is full of suffering. The world is primarily pain, largely thorns with a few roses. Secondly, there's a cause. Your desire and attachment is there. A desire means the mind is disturbed. You want something that you have not got, and this is causing your suffering. And thirdly, there is a way out. What is this way out? Everybody can attain it. And then the 4th is an 8-fold path. Again, on 2 hands, you can say, this is what you have to do. This is rightful living, rightful thinking, right occupation, and so on. All of these 8-fold things have been described in great detail in Buddhist literature. It amounts to this. He was simply saying, if you acknowledge these desires, if you're able to detach from them, if you're able to employ all your faculties, that is, your hands for right livelihood, your mind for right concentration and meditation, if you take all your feelings and direct them in a compassionate way, if you feel for all beings, all humans, all animals, every living creature, this is the way. And so, having resolved to spread this Dharma, started the first missionary movement, sending missionaries out in pairs, ultimately reaching most corners of the Eastern world, which are there. Over a period of time, it happened, as we know historically, with the help of Ashoka. But the aim was from the start, this has to be told to everybody. This good news has to be told to everybody. And why should it be so? Why should we interfere in another person's life? Because we are not insensitive to their suffering. We feel for the other, and the other requires the medicine that we have to offer. It doesn't matter about this religion. It doesn't matter about the dominance of priests. It doesn't matter about the ritualism. Animal sacrifice, that was one of the orders of the day. He was asked about it. He said, if you want to sacrifice to a god, why don't you sacrifice the best? Or make a human sacrifice. Take me, sacrifice me, he said. And then just by this way of teaching, they understood the foolishness of what they were doing. Let's make it simple. Simplicity and compassion. These are the 2 hallmarks of this great Buddha. There's a story about Nanda, who was a devotee when he went back to his palace. Nanda was somebody who was going to marry a Shakya girl, that was a girl from the Shakya clan. But at the same time, Buddha actually gave him the begging bowl of the monk and the cloth of the monk. And that confused him. What will I do with this? And so the story goes like this, that 2 men sat side by side at the meal that was to celebrate a marriage to the Sakyan woman. And as the Buddha got up to leave, he handed Nanda his begging bowl. Nanda didn't know quite what to do, but out of respect and good manners, he followed the Buddha, carrying his bowl out of the palace and all the way back to the grove outside the city where the Buddha and his followers were staying. And as Nanda left the room with the Buddha, his bride-to-be called to him, "Come back soon, prince." But it proved to be a long time before she saw him again. And when they arrived at the grove, the Buddha asked Nanda if he would not like to give up the household life and follow him. It had all happened rather quickly, and Nanda was confused. He did not have any great inclination towards the spiritual life, but had a great deal of respect for what was, in fact, his half-brother in the royal household, namely Gautama Siddhartha, or the Buddha. And because of this, he agreed and was immediately ordained as a monk. So let us review this. He's joining this just to please his half-brother. Sometime later, after they had left Kapilavastu, some of the other disciples came to the Buddha to tell him that Nanda, though now a monk, was still holding to the ways of the palace, wearing robes that had been carefully pressed and ironed, putting oil on his eyes, and using a fine glazed bowl. The Buddha called Nanda to him and asked him if what he had heard was true. And when Nanda admitted that it was, the Buddha took him to task, pointing out that having given up everything for the spiritual life, he should now be living in the forest, eating food got by begging, wearing robes made of rags collected on refuse heaps, and having nothing to do with the desires of the senses. Nanda was humbled and tried to mend his ways, but he could still not completely reconcile himself to this hard, simple life. By the way, this way of clothing oneself reminds me very much of the Franciscans when they started under this great saint, St. Francis of Assisi. The idea of wearing a habit or wearing some kind of distinguishing garb was not to enhance the pride and say, "I'm spiritual, look at me." It was to look like a beggar. About 2 years after he had left the palace to follow the Buddha, Nanda came very close to giving up the spiritual life altogether. He began telling other monks of his dissatisfaction with the monastic lifestyle and of his yearning for the world he had left behind in Kapilavastu. Again, word of this got back to the Buddha. He called Nanda and asked him if it was true that he was thinking of giving up the holy life. "It is, Lord. But why, Nanda? When I left with you that day, the beautiful Shakyan girl who was to be my wife and looked at me and said, 'Come back soon, prince.' Again and again, I think of her. I am not happy living this life." And at this, the Buddha took Nanda by the arm, in an instant took him to a heavenly world, where they saw 500 exquisitely beautiful dancing nymphs with delicate pink feet, so the story goes. "Do you see these 500 nymphs, Nanda?" "Yes, Lord, I certainly do." "So tell me, Nanda, which is more beautiful, more attractive, your Shakyan girl or these 500 nymphs?" Nanda did not have any doubt. Compared to these heavenly maidens, my Shakyan beauty was like a monkey with its nose and ears cut off. Enjoy the holy life, Nanda, and I will guarantee you will have 500 nymphs just like these. If the Buddha can guarantee me 500 nymphs like this, I shall certainly enjoy the holy life. And so Nanda threw himself into spiritual life and meditation. He went into the forest. He meditated like he'd never meditated before, driven by this motive. And once he had concluded, he came back to the Buddha. "Lord, about those 500 nymphs you promised me, I release you from your promise." And the Buddha smiled. "I know it, Nanda," he replied. "The moment your heart was freed of all craving, I was also freed from my promise." To teach simple lessons, he gave simple parables and stories. To one woman who was grieving with her husband passed away, came to the Buddha Can you restore my beloved? He says, yes, on one condition. The street on which you live, knock on every door. If you are to find anybody in the household who has not lost a loved one, then I shall do it. And of course, on every door she knocked, she couldn't find it. This was to illustrate this death is a common occurrence. It happens to us all. So Shakyamuni, the silent one of the Shakya clan, the great enlightened one, the great Buddha, was compassionate to the nth degree, even in his ultimate demise at the age of about 80, and was compassionate and was simple, not requiring any meandering of the spirit. In an age where too much dialectics was there, in an age where religion had found its demise, in an age where people were confused and troubled, in an age where religion had found its hollowness. And there was this great Buddha, this great and silent one of the Shakya clan. And in his final moments, when he did decide to leave the body, his body suffering from a last compassionate act that he did, getting food, which normally was forbidden, this food poisoning his system, but still suffering greatly in pain, he detached himself and became calm. But his last message was one of independence. With no thought from himself, he asks and makes this statement, depend on no one, work out your salvation for yourself. So Swami Vivekananda had this to say. This great man never had any thought for himself. How can we, ignorant, selfish, narrow-minded human beings, even understand the greatness of this man? And he made no distinction for himself, even at the very last. Now, one more thing. The curious thing is that in Buddhism itself, those people who follow the Dharma, follow the Sangha, follow the Buddha, follow the messages contained and assembled very quickly, very soon after Buddha's demise, at a great first council. This Tripitaka, 3 baskets, all different categories of teachings. And don't forget, 40, 45 years he was teaching. So this was an accumulation of an enormous quantity and enormous value. And those people who follow the Buddha will have this to say. This was not anything special, anything divine. And several points of view would be there. One is that he was the culmination of the accumulation of his karma in previous lives that arrived in a special way, and he was on the verge of his enlightened state. Others will say, no, he was just an ordinary person like you and me, with no special baggage to bring forward. But he had this opportunity, and he, having attained this enlightenment, encourages us to also attain this enlightenment. Because for the Buddha, the name Buddha does not mean a person. It means an enlightened state of mind that we can all achieve and attain. Now this gives us great hope and solace. But you see, Hindus take it in a different way. For the Hindus, they love Buddha more than the Buddhists because they take him as one of the descendants, the descending elements of the divine. A whole incarnation of Vishnu that comes from age to age to restore the Dharma of any age that is there. And 2,500 years ago, in many of their opinion, they have honored Buddha, not just as a human, not as a man, but as a veritable God, on equal terms, as Rama, as Krishna, as Parashurama, as all the incarnations of Vishnu that have ever gone before. in all these different forms, including human forms. And ultimately, in more modern times, we can extend this list. When the list is unlimited, because from age to age, whenever there's a need, exactly in the right context, some huge giant wave comes and delivers an eternal message that saves humanity from this death and suffering. And such a one was this great Buddha, this great enlightened one. Since then, many, many different schools of Buddhism have arrived, each interpreting their teachings in different ways, but the fundamentals remaining the same, namely the compassion and the simplicity that this great Buddha taught. May this great Buddha enlighten our own minds. May this great enlightened one who got his enlightenment at Bodh Gaya, this great entity who Swami Vivekananda visited on his 39th birthday. Visited means visited the place, the tree under which this great person got this huge transformation. In answer to a question, somebody mistaking Swami Vivekananda for a Buddhist, he said, I am the servant of the servants of Buddha. Let peace be unto all on this sacred day. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace be unto all.